Okay, I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our monthly Agape training. My name is Samantha Furman, and I'm the Agape Director on Long Island. This month's topic is entitled Common Mental Health Diagnoses and Types of Therapy, and our presenter is Sarah Gerstenzang. Sarah is a licensed clinical social worker and works as a therapist with foster and adoptive families. She's the board president of the Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition of New York and is on numerous advisory committees, including Fostering Families Today magazine and the effects of early life adversity on brain development. Additionally, she is a curriculum reviewer for TAC, the first soon to be credentialed adoption curriculum for mental health professionals in the United States, as well as an advisory committee member on the National Adoption Competency Mental Health Training Initiative. That's a mouthful. She was formerly the executive director of AFFCNY, the associate director of Adopt US Kids, and a senior policy analyst at Children's Rights. She holds a master's degree in social work from Columbia University. Her child welfare policy and practice experience includes research and publication on a range of foster care and adoption issues, as well as presentations at national and international conferences. Sarah has been a foster and kinship parent, and one of her 3 children was adopted from the New York City foster care system. She and her husband consider 2 additional siblings who are also in the foster care system and are now grown as part of their family as well. So welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for being here. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Sorry for that long introduction, everyone. I think the only important part of that is that I've parented, right? I've parented kids that have come from hard places. And I think that's my very most relevant experience, is that those thousands and thousands of hours that I've spent with them, hoping that they have a happy life. So I'm going to talk tonight. I'll just tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about, or how the flow is going to work. But I also wanted to mention that if people have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt me. I can see from the screens that we have a lot of experts here tonight, and you might have a thought or a perspective that would be relevant. So, please feel free to jump in. I really welcome it. So first, I thought it would be good for me, even though I sit in many different places in my apartment doing all these Zooms all the time. This is the chair that I actually do therapy with families. And so I thought it would be kind of relevant to sit in this spot tonight. And I just wanted to show you some of my subliminal messaging that I do with kids. If you can see this here. These are little postcards that one of my kids collected for me with all of these different mammals. We are humans, we are mammals, just like many other mammals, and we need to live in groups, right? Our young need to stay close to their parents to stay safe, and we really can't exist on our own. It's a very unhealthy mental and physical state. So I thought that would be a good thing for you guys to stare at if you get sick of looking at me. So what I'm going to be doing tonight is first giving a bit of context about mental health diagnoses. Then I'm going to be talking about some of the diagnoses that I think people are probably familiar with, that their kids have been labeled with. Then I'm going to talk about therapies, and then I'm going to talk about some other things that you might not consider therapies, but I think that are also very helpful. So context, where do diagnoses come from? What is this whole idea about? So 1952, I'm assuming a group of men got together, probably who spent very little time parenting their children, got together, and they were part of the American Psychiatric Association. And they created this diagnostic tool, which we call the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. You will often hear people refer to the DSM. So this DSM serves as the principal authority for psychiatric diagnoses in the United States. There's also like an international version that's very similar. So treatment recommendations, as well as payment, which is very important, payment by healthcare providers are often determined by DSM classifications, right? So if you get an invoice from a mental health professional, at the bottom, they actually have to put the diagnosis so that the client gets yourself, if it's your invoice, gets reimbursed appropriately. So that I think in itself is kind of interesting. And so right now we're up to the DSM-5. There have been a lot of changes over time in the DSM, right? The original one, a lot of us would probably be quite appalled at some of the things that it contained. Society's changed, or we've learned a lot, perspectives have changed. So the most recent version was from 2013, and I wanted to just read to you some of the changes that have happened, just so you get an idea of how fluid all of this diagnosis is. So, and changes in the DSM-5 included the reconceptualization of Asperger's syndrome from a distinct disorder to an autism spectrum disorder. It included the elimination of subtypes of schizophrenia, the deletion of the bereavement exclusion for depressive disorders, the renaming of gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, and the inclusion of binge eating disorder as a discrete eating disorder. So this is a very fluid guide, and many authorities have criticized the 5th edition before and after it was published. They say, for example, that some of the revisions or additions lack empirical support, that inter-rater reliability is low for many disorders. So that means if we were all professionals and we're meeting clients, we might not agree on the label for that person's behavior. So that's pretty powerful. And it says, the critics say several sections contain poorly written, confusing, or contradictory information, and that the psychiatric drug industry may have unduly influenced the manual's content because many of the workgroup participants actually had ties to pharmaceutical companies and accepted payment from them. Additionally, one of the things that's very important to know about the DSM is that it's actually much more focused on adult diagnosis than child diagnosis. So really, a lot of the diagnoses are sort of just modified for children. They're not, and it doesn't often take into child development and how the arc of child development can be very different for many children. So just to sort of make my point, I thought this was very interesting as I was been thinking about this talk for the last month or so since I was asked to do it. I happened to notice in last month's New York Times a new category, right? So it says prolonged grief is declared a mental disorder. A new diagnosis leads to treatment options. And so, and then you have two people here, feature two experts, one who says, this is so great that this is now included, and another one who says she does not believe that this is a mental illness, that this is just people being sad for a long time. So, you know, again, this is not something that's so definitive. And I thought just lastly, I wanted to read this quote from the guy who you may have heard of, Thomas Insel. He was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health for many years. And he wrote, the goal of this new manual, as with all previous editions, is to provide a common language for describing the psychopathology. While DSM has been described as a Bible for the field, it is at best a dictionary, creating a set of labels and defining each. The strength of each of the editions of DSM has been reliability. Each edition has ensured that clinicians use the same terms in the same ways. The weakness is its lack of validity. Patients with mental disorders deserve better. Right? So that's a pretty strong statement from the most senior mental health person in the United States. And so just lastly, on this point, I wanted to talk a little bit about a book that I think illustrates this point very well. There's a recent book called Hidden Valley Road, Inside the Mind of an American Family. And it's kind of like a documentary, except for it's a book. And it's about about a family with 12 children, a true story. And 6 of those 12 children ended up with very serious mental illness. Many of them died young. One of them actually murdered somebody. So 6 of the 12 children. And so this book talks about the family, what's happened in this family. And it also goes through all of the research that the family participated in, trying to understand, how did this happen? What is the cause? Like, what's at the root of schizophrenia? And it was really very inconclusive in the end. They're saying there's probably some genetic component to it. It's also environmental. It's also about personality. Even if you're in the same family, you have different resilience and different aspects of your personality that make life easier or harder. And at the end, there was this quote that I just really loved. I thought it summed up a lot of where we are with mental illness in the world today. It says, what if schizophrenia wasn't a disease at all, but a symptom? The metaphor that I like to use is that years ago, clinicians used to look at fever, like having a fever, right, high temperature, as one disease. And this is one of the world's authorities saying this. He quantifies populations of mentally ill people as a world authority. And he says, so they used to think of fever as one disease, then they split it into different types of fevers. And then they realized it's just a non-specific reaction to various illnesses. Psychosis is just what the brain does when it's not working very well, right? So I think that's a very interesting way to think about it, right? So that all being said, now that I've discredited as best as I could experts' opinions on the DSM, I'm going to talk a little bit about diagnoses, right? So the diagnoses that I'm assuming that a lot of the kids that you parent or kids that of the parents that you work with, I'm assuming a lot of the diagnoses are things like ADHD, ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, depression, reactive attachment disorder. And I just want to talk about each of those things. I want to just give 2 examples, just thinking about those diagnoses as well, giving examples of kids that I've worked with. So I worked with a boy who was given the diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, inattentive type, right? So he's not hyperactive, but he's spaced out. He's not. And what was interesting as I came to work with him was to realize that he was in middle school and he was spending a lot of time in his classroom thinking about his biological family that had lived in another country. So yes, he was inattentive, but it wasn't ADHD or ADD is usually something, it's a way that your brain works that usually you're born with, but you can have a similar types of symptoms just based on what's happened in your life. I'll give another example, oppositional defiant disorder. A child that I worked with who was in preschool was really wreaking havoc, throwing chairs around, things like that, right? And I'll even, so I have a little copy of the DSM-5 that I have in my library here. And so the definition here would, so I'd have to look as a clinician to see, does the behavior that I'm seeing or that I've heard about from the teachers or the parents actually reflect what's in this dictionary, as Thomas Insel said, of the DSM-5. So it says here, a pattern of angry, irritable mood, argumentative, defiant behavior, and vindictiveness lasting at least 6 months is evidenced by at least 4 symptoms from any of the following categories and exhibited during interaction with at least one individual who is not a sibling, which is almost hilarious, that last bit about the sibling. So this child, you'd think in a way they met this behavior had been going on. The preschool said, I can't keep this child in the class anymore because he's so out of control. Well, after some time, it turns out that this child had been moved from another country, a very impoverished country, which was a very dangerous place to live. And they lived in a very dangerous place in a city in that country. And then had just been moved with a parent. And after some time, it became apparent that the child had thought that he could actually be kidnapped at any time from this classroom. When he wasn't with his parent, he felt so unsafe. He felt he could just be, somebody could barge in, which did happen in his country of origin, and people could be taken. And so he worked all day long to keep the teacher's attention, even if it meant knocking the chairs over, right? So is that really oppositional defiant disorder, or is it, and does it matter, right? We have to really think about where the behavior comes from. So I think one of the other points I wanted to make is that things that, another aspect of giving diagnoses that's not often mentioned, but is possibly even more important, is what has happened to the child in utero. Have they been exposed to extreme stress through their biological mother? Was there alcohol exposure to nicotine or other substances? These experiences can obviously impact the brain in a very serious way. So, and really what I'm wanting to talk about more is the diagnoses, we have to use that word, of something called, complex developmental trauma, right? Or what some people call pediatric PTSD. And these terms are not in the DSM-5. There has been a movement to include a diagnosis like that. But I, even though they're not in there, I think that most experts in this area would agree that these are much more accurate descriptors of where our kids or why they behave the way they do. Or as Bruce Perry and Oprah like to say in their book, not what is wrong with you, but actually what happened to you, right? And when we are thinking about that, right, what are these experiences that have impacted the way we are in the world? Last May at the Coalition Conference, right, we had this amazing talk by Bruce Perry, where he talked about this very large study he's doing, which is showing the extraordinary importance of the first 60 days of life, right? So we know in utero is extremely important. And then he has documented that those first 60 days and what happens in that time period is more influential than any other days, no matter what happens in the rest of the child's childhood, right? So that is really, and many clinicians actually very rarely will ask about that early time, even though, I mean, this is new research, but it's also, extraordinarily important to learn about. So another point that I wanted to make was that that research shows actually that the most effective therapy is not a certain approach, but it's actually the relationship that the provider has with the client. So if you come to me and I seem trustworthy and empathetic and whatever, and we get along, right? Somehow you think know what I'm talking about, or I'm remind you of somebody you care about, you are going to feel better working with me. It's not about what I'm actually doing with you each time we're talking, right? It's more about the relationship, which I think is really no surprise for any of us, because we know how important the relationship between the parent and the child is, right? So a therapeutic relationship is really just a relationship between two humans, right? So I think that's very important to point. I would say it's extremely important, not again what approach the therapist is taking, but the fact that if they have experience with complex developmental trauma. I once saw this study that that had a quote from a 9-year-old on the top of it, and I'll never forget it. He said, "My other therapist was too afraid to talk about what happened to me." Right? So if a therapist doesn't really understand complex developmental trauma, understand how important those early experiences were, if they feel too sad to talk about the fact that a child doesn't live with their biological family, then they're not going to be very effective in helping a child, because they're leaving the child alone with those feelings. So I wanted to just talk about 4 points that I think that a good therapist who understands complex developmental trauma will have knowledge of. The first is something called confabulation. And confabulation is a memory error defined as the production of fabricated, distorted, or misinterpreted memories about oneself or the world, right? So it's a very important concept. I think the second thing a competent therapist in this field would understand is that anxiety and depression is normal for this population, and especially within a certain period of the development, often like starting around 11 through teenage years, it seems, and I don't know if we understand why yet, but it seems to be very prominent, anxiety and depression. And I just want to tell you briefly about a study that was very interesting. It was a study of 226 internationally adopted Chinese youth, and then 1,059 non-adopted Chinese peers living in China. So kids who got to stay home with their birth families, and then 209 non-adopted American peers. So they looked at all of these groups, and they noticed that the adopted Chinese youth outperformed their Chinese counterparts in all comparisons of behavior problems and pro-social adjustment, and their US counterparts in most comparisons, with the evidence, that the high family socioeconomic status of the adoptive families compensated for the risks of institutionalization, right? So, I mean, I think this is sort of a basic argument. And for many people in this country, we really need to do better to support all families, because families living in really abject poverty with no resources, it's very hard for their children to thrive, right? That adults need to be have some measure of stability and nourishment and stable housing to take care of their children well. And so what they noticed is that adoptive families from the US, it's expensive to adopt from China, they had enough, socioeconomic stability that they were able to give tutoring and all these things, and it really helped the kids, is basically the bottom line. However, there were 2 areas of problematic adjustment for the adopted youth, and what they saw was depression and social stress, right? So those kids were really differentiated from their peers who got to live in their biological families, even though they had a lot of advantages, and because their experiences impacted them in this way, which makes tremendous sense. So the third area that's very important that a therapist has experience in is implicit memory. So implicit memories are, you guys may have heard about it. I'm sure everyone at the coalition talks a lot about them, but they're stored as feelings and they can easily be triggered. So I often think about an implicit memory when you see a child have an explosion that doesn't seem to match the situation. So the kids are in kindergarten. Another kid gets more snack. Okay, it's not like a little tear or a little sad face, or can I have more snack? She has more snack. It's an explosion, right? It's a total meltdown. The teachers are shocked. Well, if you really spend time and you ask a child about that, that is because it felt so unfair, right? They have shown that actually a lot of other mammals actually have a sense of fairness or unfairness, right? If they've done these studies with monkeys where one gets more grapes than another. And so, and babies seem to have a sense of unfairness. And I've noticed in a lot of kids, this is like an implicit memory, a feeling that can be triggered in a situation that seems not connected at all, but yet we see that in the behavior. So another implicit memory might be a parent, with a big explosion, a parent going out to dinner, right? Or a child going away to college, and what might that trigger? That sense of abandonment, right? The kids can have like very dramatic reactions to these things, which doesn't mean that they're mentally ill. It means that there's a implicit memory that's triggered, and that has to be understood so everything could be thought about in context. So the fourth part that I would say that is very important for a therapist to understand would be how important it is to include parents in the work with children, right? It seems actually common practice in the United States, unfortunately, for therapists to see children alone. I personally don't agree with this idea, but I would say it's absolutely counterindicated or contraindicated, I guess you'd say, for kids who have already been separated from their families. The therapist needs to include the parents. So actually, as the therapist is working with a child to understand how these early experiences have impact their life now, the parents need to understand what the kids are saying, right? When a kid says, when my mom goes out to dinner, I'm worried she's never going to come back, right? Which is not a crazy thought if your parent has left you and not come back. And in some situations, you've been moved several times, right? That's not crazy at all. If the child's just saying that to the therapist and the parent has no idea, then how is that ever going to be fixed? Is the therapist going to say, oh, that's ridiculous, right? Makes no sense. So, and it's also extraordinarily important because what the therapist really needs to understand is how incredibly important that parents are to the healing process, right? Therapists don't really heal kids, parents do. And so it's really important that the therapists support the parents, that they understand that the literature shows that in every child who is resilient, every child, there has been an adult to help process the events of that child's life, right? To understand what happened in their early life, where they are now, why they're there, and also to give them, an appropriate, nurturing, loving environment. And it's also very important that the therapists help the parents learn to regulate themselves, right? We've all been parented, we're all triggered by things. And we know also from research when they're measuring stress hormone levels and so forth, and looking at kids in different situations, that kids cannot stay calm. They cannot get calm if their parents are not calm first, right? It's just physiologically impossible for them. And that's actually, I think, a very interesting concept in itself. So kids go through traumatic things all over the world, but they're rarely damaged by it because they're under the protective umbrella of their biological family. If the parents stay calm, don't overly discuss what's happening with the kids, and the kids feel safe within their little nurtured family, they actually don't have PTSD from really bad things happening, because the parents are weathering and protecting their children from those experiences if they're able to do that. So obviously, a lot of the groups and the trainings of the coalition focus on supporting families. And the reason we do that is because it's it's the most effective way of helping children. So now I want to talk a little bit about the actual different types of therapies. And I want to just say that it's a very complex process. Exactly. We don't really understand exactly how humans heal from things. I mean, we have ideas, and these different therapies, which I'll talk about, will address certain aspects of, I would say, I guess, recovery or healing. But it's not like, when you go to the dentist and you have a cavity, and dentist like cleans out all that cavity area or whatever, that, the rotten area of your tooth, and it's all cleaned, and then they put in, some kind of filling, and you go out and it's done. It's just not like that at all, unfortunately, right? I mean, sometimes I always joke with kids, I wish I could unzip you and then just take out that really hard part, put in the good part you should have had, and then zip you right back up, right? It's a lot of work, because the brain is very complex, and the way we embed memory is very complex. And many good therapists use actually multiple approaches, different aspects of different parts of these therapies, just through their intuition, or kind of seeing where the clients are. And I will, just before I get into those, I want to mention that Harvard University Center on the Developing Child has a really great website talking about toxic stress. And I know the coalition uses a lot of their videos, but one of the most important features, I think, of that website is their summary of the research on resilience. And what they note is that to be resilient, kids need three things: a stable adult to stay connected with them, right? So like for my husband, that was actually his grandmother. He had parents, but his grandmother was his stable adult. She didn't live in his house. She lived around the corner, but he saw her every day of his life. And she really made him, in some ways, the person that he is. The second thing that kids need is competence. You cannot grow into a resilient adult if you do not feel competent, right? Which is also why I think school is so threatening for a lot of the kids we work with, right? Because they might have some kind of learning challenges, and so they don't feel competent. It's very hard to show up. I always say to parents, like, how would you like to go to work each day if you didn't feel that great at it? That is not easy. No wonder they're trying to, not go to school. And the third thing is manageable threats, right? So we can't like bubble wrap the kids. Oh my God, all this terrible stuff happened to you, and now you're never going to have anything terrible happen again. No, what they need is small doses of things that are hard, but they find a way to get through it, right? And therapy is actually kind of like that, because in therapy, we are talking about their early life, the fact that they may never know who their biological family is, or that their biological family hurt them, and made life very miserable for them. But it's actually not the injury, right? I'm not in therapy actually neglecting or abusing children. I'm actually helping them talk about it. That actually is a manageable threat. It is threatening. It's hard. I've had kids run out of my office, down the hall, break things, throw things, and so on, because it feels threatening. But then actually, as we're talking, it becomes manageable for them. And then they're reincorporating all that experience in a way that allows them to function. Okay, so now on to the therapies. So the first one I want to talk about is something called dialectical behavioral therapy. And this therapy was created actually by a woman who had the same symptoms that she was designing the therapy to address. So it was for what we call borderline personality disorder. She actually now wishes she had called it emotional regulation disorder. And I really wish she had too. And I really wish they would change the name of it, because I think it's much less stigmatizing and it's much more descriptive of what's the experience is like. So the goals, I'm just going to do a really quick overview of each of these therapies. So the goals include teaching people new, more effective behaviors to replace dangerous and problematic behaviors, right? So it could be like cutting or suicidal behavior, or running away, or using substances. And it also teaches them how to think dialectically in order to accept that different perspectives that may seem contradictory can be true. So like a child I worked with had this sense of, my parents don't have my well-being in mind, right? So these are two contradictory ideas. This child felt sometimes so firmly, so passionately, that his parents did not have his well-being in mind, right? That was a really painful, hard way to, you're living in this family, you're dependent on these parents, and you think they don't have your well-being in mind. And at the same time, the parents were taking care of all this child's needs, right? So again, this is a very likely an implicit memory, an early experience, having a hard time trusting adults in your life when adults have treated you very badly. So it's having these two ideas and at the same time and trying to work through that. So a big part of DBT is noticing, but not dismissing out of control feelings, right? And the components of it are something what they call distress tolerance. And part of that is like learning to distract yourself or to radically accept the situation. I love that concept of radical acceptance. Includes mindfulness, learning emotional regulation skills, and interpersonal effectiveness, like really how to get along with other people. And there's a website that was created called borderlinepersonalitydisorder.org, which is really great videos for parents on it. And as well as some talks by professionals and things if you're interested in learning more. But there's also some just like really fantastic books on this concept. So I'm just going to show these briefly. I know Sam is going to drop some of the titles in the chat. But these books talk so eloquently to kids who are emotionally dysregulated, and they're just very specific suggestions for adults as well. And here's the same, basically the companion. I call them the red and the blue books. One's for kids and one's for teens. And then there's a workbook on this that I also use a lot. Don't let your emotions run your life for teens. For kids. And there is also a adolescent version of this workbook. So this is something therapists use them, but parents just get them on Amazon. And it's this book talks a lot about teaching kids to keep the facts and the feelings in their head at the same time. And I love that idea, right? So it's like, it has a little experiment that kids can do where the facts are rocks and the feelings are sand. And then it has this thing where you take a jar and show a kid, if you fill the whole jar with sand, then there's no room for the rocks, right? So it's this idea of trying to keep in your mind both the facts and the feelings, what they call the wise mind. And that's a very basic concept of DBT, is using your wise mind. So that is one type of therapy. There's also something which probably everybody has heard of, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. And this type of therapy is focused on negative patterns of thought about the self and the world, which are challenged in order to alter unwanted behavior patterns or treat mood disorders such as depression. And I just want to mention here that there's also another resource called Child Mind, which maybe you've seen before, but they have a lot of information on basic therapies like this. So like cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's a handout here that I had printed out, which is called How to Change Negative Thinking Patterns, right? So in this, they have different negative thinking patterns, like, so one would be overgeneralization is one here. So taking one negative event or detail about a situation and making it a universal pattern that is a truth about your whole life. And then the example would be, this person didn't want to hang out with me. No one ever wants to hang out with me. Or I messed up my chemistry experiment today. I never do anything right. So you're overgeneralizing. You're taking one little fact and you're making it really big. And so they talk about these thought patterns and then give kids tools to overcome those types of negative thinking patterns. They also have videos now online where they talk about thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So this, again, is a core idea of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? We have a thought, which gives us a feeling, and then from which we then have we have certain behaviors around. So one of the ones I like to think of for myself is, I grew up in upstate New York, in a small town. And then we moved to Albany, and I was outside a lot and very used to nature and a clean environment. I moved to New York City, and it seemed very dirty to say. I do love it now. I live in Brooklyn and I absolutely love it. But I would come from upstate New York, visiting my family, and I would just feel depressed, right? I just felt so New York City, I guess. So I had this really negative thought about it, right? And then I might be, I might feel kind of depressed about that, kind of trapped maybe, and I might be really grouchy, right, with my kids. So one day I just thought, I'm just sick of thinking this. Every year I come back from vacation, I have this same thought. And I thought to myself, the one great thing about New York City is we walk everywhere, right? We walk to the subway, we take the bus, or we walk if we can, if it's not too far. And I'm like, I am outside all the time. I live in New York City and I love the outdoors, and I'm actually not in a car. I don't own a car. I'm outside all the time. That made me feel happy, right? That was my feeling. And then I was much nicer to my kids. Hopefully I wasn't too bad before, but that's an example of how cognitive behavioral therapy works, right? And I think that is a really important concept. People often focus on the behavior changing the behavior as a short-term solution, it's not that effective, right? I mean, we can get kids to comply with things most of the time. But if we really want to make life easier, we have to understand what the thoughts are so that the feelings change, and then the behavior, it's like a no-brainer. So easy. So one of the things, like one of the most core thoughts that I work with kids is their feelings about themselves as a baby. So I have lots of baby dolls in my office, and I will take a doll. Tonight I just have these tiny 2 little dolls that my sister got me, and I'll take one of these babies and I'll say to kids like, oh my gosh, she is so sweet. Oh my, she is just adorable. I mean, this baby deserves so much love and attention. Oh my gosh, she's actually a twin. Look at the 2 of them. I mean, I just can't stop thinking about how I would like to snuggle them. So a lot of times when I do this in my office, kids become extremely angry. They said to me, I feel like ripping that doll. I feel like throwing it in the garbage, right? It's so triggering just to see me pick up a plastic doll, because a lot of their core beliefs about themselves are that they were not lovable, right? They were abandoned, they were mistreated because they were not lovable. And so what I'm trying to help them see, that all humans are deserving of love and care equally, no matter where you're born or what circumstances you're born into. And it's very hard for them to get their mind around that. But if they can understand it's the adults that caused the distress for themselves, right? That caused the situation. It wasn't them. And if you shift that and you think of yourself as a valuable person in the world, you can put effort into your schoolwork. You can have friends. You can allow your parents to love you and hug you, right? Instead of, you can allow them to compliment you, because if you're complimented, you feel like, yes, I am a lovable person and I do deserve this compliment, not like, don't point out to me this thing that I know that's not going to be true, and then makes me feel ashamed, right? You're like shaming me by, that's sometimes how that's interpreted. So again, cognitive behavioral therapy, I think there's aspects of it which are extremely important and applicable to the kids that we parent. So the good things about DBT and CBT are that they have been used with many, many people, right? There's in their standardized protocols often, or you can sort of adapt them. And so when you go to a clinician with those types of therapies, they actually, you kind of know what you're getting, right? And that they've been proven effective in all these big research studies. The problem is, of course, that they haven't actually been used with kids with complex developmental trauma. So they're not specifically applied, but it doesn't mean that they're not, aspects of them are not useful. So the next type of therapy I want to talk about is something that's probably not widely available in New York, but I think it's also still interesting to talk about. Is something called Q-centered therapy by a guy called Victor Carrion at Stanford. And he says Q, he means trigger, when we would say trigger centered therapy here on the East Coast. And the thing that about his therapy, which is very important, is that actually it's focused on what he calls pediatric PTSD, right? The part that is not that relevant is he uses it on a kid who's like in a car crash, right? So that is a different type of PTSD. I like to say complex developmental trauma, because usually it's many negative experiences. It's not one, car accident or house burning down or something like that. That's a one incident. It's very different than not having a reliable caregiver, or being left by your caregiver, or living in an orphanage, or all of these experiences, which really impact the entire developmental trajectory of a child's life. But anyway, some aspects of this are very useful. And he developed it to address and improve executive function, which has been documented in research, right? The front of our brain, which helps us make good choices and plan and not be impulsive and all these things, and emotional regulation. And I think one of the things that's very interesting in his approach is that because he's at Stanford and they have tons of money, he was able to take the 7 components of his intervention and move them around so he could see what was most effective and what had the biggest change, which aspect of which component had the biggest change. And the part that had the biggest change was the psychoeducation. And I think that is just amazing, right? So kids who've told me before, like they think they're crazy, right? Because they have these overwhelming emotions that do not match what's happening in the moment. And they have this very uncomfortable feeling. But when you say to a child, these things that happen to you have impacted you dramatically. This is normal. This is what happens to humans when they go through what happened to you, what shouldn't have happened to you. And that actually is the most therapeutic intervention, is just to let kids know that that is normal and that's, okay, and that you're going to figure it out. What I really love also, I heard him talk once, and he had this very funny expression, which he said that the problem with most therapy is it's the cow crisis of the week. So the cow crisis, right? And he said, you have to focus on the trauma, not on the cow, right? So I had a kid who told me recently that a therapist would often talk to him about how his poor performance in sports and how upsetting that was to him. And especially if he didn't make a goal, right? But that's all they would talk about, what happened in the game, right? They never talked about how the child had moved multiple times. So when he didn't score in soccer and he wasn't affirmed that he was a good person, he was a valuable, worthy person, then he felt really terrible. It's really not right about the cow, right? It's about the trauma. Okay, so the last thing that I want to type of therapy approach that I want to mention is this book, which I think the coalition has talked about before. This is The Science of Parenting Adopted Children. It's a body of work by Arleta James in Ohio. And when in my parent group, parents have told me that actually is the first book that ever really understood how they felt as parents parenting their children. They really got it, described their children, and understood their experience. And one of the things I love about this book is it's one of the very few places that talks about complex developmental trauma impacting children throughout their entire childhood. It's not something you go and you fix in 10 sessions, right? It really impacts the child's sense of self, the way they fit into the family, the way you have to parent. And she makes analogies to diabetes or other physiological conditions, because complex developmental trauma is a physiological condition. It impacts your stress hormone levels. It impacts sleep, that we know sleep patterns are different, impacts eating. And so I think it's a really truthful and useful book. It also, she has a lot of approaches that go back to what the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard says, which is how to help your child overcome manageable threats and feel competent. So anyway, I will just wanted to provide you with that, that as a resource if you're interested. So I'm getting to the end. I was wondering if I was going to have enough material, and I'm realizing that we're almost on an hour. So I'm going to wrap it up very quickly so we have time for questions. But I want to say that, you know, a lot of major universities in the United States, Columbia, Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and I'm sure many other places have projects now to research how early childhood diversity impacts development. So hopefully we're going to be learning more, have more interventions and therapies and so forth to help our children in the future. We definitely are a lot further than we were, you know, 20 or 40 years ago. So quickly, a few things that are also very therapeutic. At the Center on the Developing Child, they have a whole section on executive function, and they're games that you can play with your child to improve their executive function. Things like Simon Says or red light, green light. And it's very helpful because you can kind of see what age your child behaves like. Start there and start doing these games. And that actually will help your child be a better student, have an easier time in life. So I love that. I want to mention also yoga, which has definitely been shown to alter the physiology and be helpful, improve sleep, meditation. I love the Headspace app. I think it's extremely helpful. We know that also helps parents and children. Neurofeedback, time outside, exercise, and sleep. Those huge interventions. And then lastly, I just want to finish on the idea of play and how extraordinarily important it is to be playful with your child and give them opportunities to be playful for you. That's the way we connect. And if we look back at my animals up here, you can see we're not the only mammals that you know, use play to stay connected and to learn. So this is another, lastly, great resource, this TheraPlay book, which, like the executive function, has, you know, the beginning parts are somewhat interesting, but at the back, there's lists of different types of games that you can play to reinforce either learning to regulate, so the child can learn to regulate themselves or be in better relationship. One of the, I think, most important, easiest ways to get in relationship with a child who has a very hard time relating to a parent is just doing a ball toss. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's so simple, and it's about that back and forth. That is really important to embed in your relationship as two humans.